thank you, Professor Habib, for being here. And I'm so pleased that you agreed to address us today. And I want to start out maybe just by saying a little something about somebody reminded me recently that Professor Habib, who used to be, I first got to know in J Block on the Westville campus at the University of Durban, Westville. And someone reminded me recently, have you counted the number of vice-chancellors and deputy vice-chancellors that have come from J Block? So J Block is, for those of you who don't know, it used to be a former, it housed education, psychology, political science in the former University of Durban-Westville. And it's a block it looks like a school, actually. And it's right next to the Graduate School of Business. But it's really a pleasure for me to welcome Professor Habib, who is, as you will know, the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Witwatersrand. He is an academic, activist, administrator, and a renowned political media commentator and columnist. He is a professor of political science, and his experience spans 5 universities and multiple local and international institutions, boards, and task teams. Professor Habib has served as the former Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research, Innovation, Library, and Faculty Coordination at the University of Johannesburg, and he has also been the Executive Director of the Human Sciences Research Council and a Research Director on Governance and Democracy. Prior to that, he was a professor in the School of Development Studies at the former University of Natal and the Research Director of the Center for Civil Society. It's really absolutely my pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Habib and to address us this morning. Thank you.
Okay, it's lovely seeing you. Friends, colleagues, it's always a great pleasure to come back to UKZN. You know, I studied here for my undergraduate years. I came and did my master's. I often describe it as the kind of formative place where I learned my politics. And so for all of the burdens of all of the mistakes I make, you can blame UKZN and the environment at UKZN. I must say the other week, as we see the ferment at universities, I've been thinking about, it reminds me of an earlier period in South Africa's history. Just after the transition at about 95, 96, 97, where serious questions were emerging about the university, what it means, and some of the challenges at the university. And it similarly divided the university community in very serious ways. So I can't think of a better time, if you like, to be at UKZN and to have the pleasure of engaging you here. So, Renuka, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and very generous introduction. Friends, colleagues, there are a number of faces I recognize. It's lovely to meet, to interact with colleagues again. You know, when Robbie invited me to do this, I said, I'm not sure I'm the right person to do this. I think what you need is to get somebody who speaks to, understands in far more greater detail the pedagogies of teaching and learning. And while I'm a vice-chancellor, I'm also, if you like, more of a bureaucrat. And I'm not as well-versed as many of you are on the pedagogies of teaching and learning. And he said, no, well, what we want to do is have a broader conversation, at least at the keynote address, around the systemic questions that we need to confront. And I had just finished a piece, which will be coming out later in the year in the Journal for Southern African Studies, on the lessons of the last 20 years in South African higher education. And as part of that, there was a big debate on transformation, but also a significant component of that piece was on differentiation in higher education. And so what we had agreed I'd do is speak to this issue of differentiation of the higher education system and its importance. But before I go to that, I cannot but think of the importance of actually saying a few words around transformation itself, around the challenges that are confronting us, and the hard questions we need to confront as we go forward. I'm particularly struck by the tensions that largely emerged as a result of the Rhodes Must Fall movement at UCT, and then moved on to Stellenbosch and Rhodes University. It's been, if you like, very much in the public eye at Wits University, and most recently at UKZN, with what I would just simply describe as the atrocious attacks. And I think we have to say a couple of words, at least by way of introduction to this broader issue around transformation, what we mean, what our agenda is, and what we should be debating. And I want to raise 4 issues which I think are important to the transformation debate. And I think it's absolutely important we put this firmly and squarely on the agenda. Because I do think that people have used Bantu Stephen Biko and Frantz Fanon in very, very dubious ways. And I think that there is a real urgent need to grapple with the thinking of Frantz Fanon and Bantu Stephen Biko, both of whom represented incredible thinkers. I also want to say that I think that the current upsurge around transformation is not surprising. Frankly, to be honest, we've been sleeping on the wheel. The fact that 21 years later, we have a debate like the way we're having in the middle of Stellenbosch is an outrageous situation. And the fact that you have in many parts of our country, including in places like Wits, where more than 75% of our students are black but still feel alienated from the very environment in which they constitute a majority, is something that we should be very, very worried about. And so I think that, frankly, all of us, vice-chancellors included, but not only vice-chancellors, I think academics, I think student leadership, but I also think government has been sleeping on the wheel. And one of the most striking things about this transformation debate is a whole series of people are trying to blame each other. So Vice-Chancellor is saying that the problem is government, you didn't do enough. Government trying to pass off the buck and actually, frankly, has not demonstrated any sense of leadership around these issues. And a whole range of others, unions and others, who are simply standing aside and saying that it's the other. But I think we frankly have been collectively responsible for the failures of progress around transformation. And I think that if we are to make progress, we need a sense of clarity. And therefore, I want to touch on 4 fundamental issues which I think are absolutely fundamental to the transformation issue before I move on to the differentiation question. The first is, I think that there's been an enormous confusion between radical and violent. I've said this before and I say it again. I think, I've time and time again struck by how suddenly people have confused radical with violent in our discourse. And while there is no doubt that poor people in our society, particularly poor black people, have been the subject and victims of structural violence, that does not mean that suddenly there's carte blanche and people have carte blanche to start undertaking violent activity. I had a debate the other day with a student who said to me, well, in the historical moment we're in, that perhaps we have a right to be violent against monopoly capitalism. And I said to him, how did you jump from that to choking that poor black student that you were choking and you were caught choking? And how did you make the jump from monopoly capitalism to the individual that you landed up choking in the middle of a classroom? And I think that while we must recognize the importance of transformation, while we must recognize the contribution of the Rhodes Must Fall movement to putting transformation firmly on the agenda, what we mustn't do is romanticize it to the point where we become sanguine about violence itself. Because the victims of violence are never the rich, and they're never the privileged. They always tend out to be the poor and the disadvantaged. And so I want to firmly put it on the table because I know I'm going to get into trouble for this. But I think it's absolutely fundamental to say, don't become sanguine by violence. And don't justify radical and confuse radical with violent. Those are two fundamentally different concepts. The second principle that I think is absolutely, this again, I was quite struck by the fact that Renuka touched on it, is how do we establish caring within our very institutions and within our curriculum? And how possible is it to establish caring in an uncaring society? Because I don't think it should paralyze us. I don't think we should say there's nothing we can do. But neither can we be responsible for fixing all of the travails of South African society within the university itself. And I think it's one of the real tragedies of our moment, where suddenly people who are unhappy with the failures of progress on multiple other levels of society are now saying, well, the university must resolve it. And I want to be clear, the university is very much a part of the society itself. And yes, it may be, and it can be the imagination of what the future of a society need be, but it can't be an island within the society. And so it is as constrained by the realities of the structural configurations of power in the society. And so while we need to push the boundaries of what is possible, we must understand the limits itself, lest we suddenly be accused of having unrealistic agendas. The third, again raised by Renuka, which I think is absolutely important, is the importance of creativity in the production of knowledge. And you actually cannot be creative in the production of knowledge if you don't have two principles, it seems to me. One is the principle of harnessing the corpus of scientific knowledge from around the world. But the second is using your locality as the very source of innovation itself. That it is actually not a contradiction to say that it is precisely through your national responsiveness that the very principles of authenticity, of innovation actually lie. And it is precisely through that that you can make a contribution to the global academy in ways that are distinctive from anybody else. That doesn't mean a nationalistic, insular consciousness. Obviously, you need to inherit from the global corpus of knowledge. But you need to take that and apply it in ways that are innovative to your context, and in the process innovate itself and hand it back to the global academy. And too often we think that to be really innovative means simply to imitate the foreign. But ironically, if you look at South Africa's history, whether it's deep level mining, or whether it's cardiothoracic surgery, or whether it's all of the other challenges we have, it is precisely to the responsiveness of the local that the very source of innovation lay. And that these are not mutually exclusive goals, they are part of the singular project of enhancing and creating a global academy. And the fourth thing, which I think is absolutely important, is the issue of quality. I think there's a false debate that has emerged in South Africa around quality. And the debate has gone something like this, that the old guard, if you like, the inheritors of apartheid universities are the arbiters of quality, and therefore we don't have to worry about quality. Because by the very nature that we indigenous or we're going to be transformative, that quality itself will happen. Well, I'm sorry to say that's not true. We should not be paralyzed by ignoring quality simply because others have used it as the gatekeepers to the institution itself. Quality is an important thing. And if anybody kind of has walked around schools in townships, you'd actually know that we've sacrificed quality in a significant degree in many cases. Not all cases, in many cases. And to simply give up the importance of quality is, I think, a very, very dangerous principle. What we must make sure is that quality is never used as a mechanism for exclusion, because that has also been part of our history, where quality has become the weapon by which you exclude others. You use as a mechanism to prevent increasing access and diversity and all of the things that are important. But that does not mean we should ignore quality itself. We need to define it, we need to rethink it, but it never can be ignored as a principle, especially given the fact that there are serious questions emerging of all of our universities about how is it that so many of our graduates are unable to do certain basic things that one would have taken for granted at a different historical epoch. I've got cabinet minister after cabinet minister who writes to me and says, how is it that a master's student cannot put a memo together for this? And what are the challenges of this in a world where we need to this? So I do think there are some serious questions about quality. And this quality itself should not be simply handed over to the if you like, the gatekeepers of old. That really it cannot be used as a weapon to exclude, but it's very, very much a project that we should be defining and being part of the post-apartheid university. So I do think that those 4 principles are fundamentally important. And if we're going to translate the current student ferment into a truly transformative and innovative university enterprise, then actually we're going to have to confront those 4 political questions, those 4 principles. And that's going to take courage, colleagues. It's going to take enormous courage. Not simply courage from the Vice-Chancellor and the executives. It's going to take courage from the academy and the student leadership itself. Because it might very well mean we have to ask hard questions about ourselves. We have to engage in a self-reflection on what we've taken intellectually for granted, and ask the hard questions about what we think needs to happen as we go forward. And so courage is not simply standing up to the violent actions. Courage is having the ability to confront what we've been comfortable with intellectually for too long, and to ask whether that represents what we truly is in the interest of this country. And so I do think we're in that moment where we actually need to start asking some hard questions about who we are and what do we want to become as an institution, and what will it take to move in that direction. Let me say a couple of things about differentiation then, since that's what I promised to talk about, Ravi. It seems to me a differentiated higher education system, and it's a kind of banal point, which we all tend to agree with, but then we don't tend to internalize, is that a differentiated higher education system is a prerequisite for both economic competitiveness and inclusive development. The most striking example of this is often Finland, by the way. I don't think it has one, it maybe have one, but not many. I don't think it doesn't have one university in the top 50 in the world. Yet, every single year, it comes out number 1 in the competitiveness rankings globally. And that's because it actually is a higher education system that's differentiated, that's independent, but that actually that is actually coherent and feeds into each other in ways that are quite amazing. And that it has a mobility within the higher education system that is actually quite useful. It creates, in effect, a seamless system that is both nationally responsive and globally competitive. And I think that there is much to learn from this, and I think that this differentiated system is absolutely necessary for a number of reasons. First, it enables responsiveness to the diverse and multiple needs of an economy and a society. In South Africa, we need to do multiple things simultaneously. I wish we didn't have to. In many other contexts, societies and the university systems responded to a particular social need at a particular historical trajectory. We, given the fact that we've got our freedom at the end of, if you like, of the 20th century and at the dawn of the 21st, means that we've got to do multiple things simultaneously. We need to play a significant role in the teaching of undergraduate students and professionals and the production of professionals to meet market skill needs. We know that. And that's going to be necessary to achieve economic competitiveness. We need to produce postgraduate students and to undertake high-level research, which are equally essential to be successful in a knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. And yet again, we need to produce a post-secondary non-university sector, a further education sector which comprises colleges focused on producing graduates with vocational and applied skills. These different responsibilities require very, very different skill sets, institutional environments, and investment patterns. This is why they cannot be simply done by any single institution or any single university. There are blurred boundaries between all of these needs, obviously. But you actually have to bring these institutions together, and you have to create institutions with a distinctive set of types, with a distinctive set of investment patterns, and with very, very distinctive institutional environments. This is why a differentiated system is so necessary. We often forget this. We look at the United States, and we forget that the United States is made up of at least between 4,000 to 5,000 universities. All do not look like Harvard. All do not perform like Harvard. We forget that. We forget that if you look at the most successful higher education systems, they're highly differentiated. And they have multiple different agendas, multiple different investment patterns, etc. Now we know this. But why is it that despite knowing it, despite knowing that we need a differentiated higher education system, we still haven't been able to move towards it significantly in the last 20 years? And the answer lies in our history, which has saddled the evolution of our system and our current choices with the burden of a racialized legacy. Too often, higher education leaders and vice chancellors, I might say, want to build an institution that they were not allowed to build under apartheid. That's the plan. Too often we want to be what we were never allowed to be. But unfortunately, if we all succeeded in being what we were never allowed to be, we would never be responsive to the multiple needs of our society. That's the historic challenge we confront. We burdened, in Steve Biko's phrase, by a colonial consciousness. And until the higher education leaders have the courage to free their minds from that colonial consciousness, we will never be able to make the break towards a differentiated system. And so it seems to me, as we struggle to do this, and we are going to struggle, there's a couple of things that we need to do as we move forward. And it seems to me we need to think through the differentiating principle on four distinctive principles. The first, it needs to be underscored that the research enterprise has to be common to all of our universities. We cannot simply say that some of our universities are going to do research and other institutions are not. Even the universities primarily focused on the teaching of undergraduate students must be engaged in research. Otherwise, how else can they guarantee that their academics are the forefront of teaching the latest developments in their disciplinary fields? The only difference, it seems to me, between universities focused on doing undergraduate teaching and others is in the amount of research required and perhaps even on the type of research activities. But the fact is that research must be part of the enterprise. Second, South African university executives and government need to get rid of themselves of a statist conception of the university system, where research-intensive universities are seen as more illustrious than their undergraduate teaching counterparts. One of the biggest problems here. And frankly, the global ranking systems have fostered this illusion even further, burdening the imagination and the ambition of university executives. With the result that too many of us have chased the elusive goal of evolving into a research-intensive university. There are actually multiple institutions with multiple needs actually fulfill very, very diverse requirements and needs of the society and the global community. And that it is precisely our mandate that should define our illustriousness and our performance vis-a-vis our mandate, rather than some arbitrary hierarchical distinction about the importance of the research-intensive university, the research university, the undergraduate teaching university, and the vocational college, etc. We need to get rid of a status conception, and it seems to burden us every single moment of the last 20 or 21 years. Third, and related to the above, our financing of universities must not implicitly assume the status hierarchy. You would not believe how many times I've spoken to colleagues in places like WITS, where people say to me, well, you know, the research-intensive university must get the largest share of the national purse. Whether we like it or not, actually what we've just got to come to terms with is the fact that WITS is a product of an apartheid history, but it's nevertheless part of our history. Now we have to just make sure that it continues to perform as against its global peers, and therefore it requires the largest share of the higher education fiscus. But what is there to suggest that the research-intensive university requires the largest share? Why not the undergraduate teaching college, which is intended to provide and produce the kinds of professionals that are required? Why not, as Renuka was saying, expand the 4th year of the degree program? Because actually, producing the 4th year of the degree program creates that interface that allows people to both move into the professional streams, but also into the academic and postgraduate streams that create the intensive university. It seems to me far more important at this historical moment than the research-intensive, this thing. And so we need a really open conversation at this historical moment about what is our national needs, what should be commanding the broadest investment from the higher education fiscus, and how does that get deployed? And there should not be any assumption that this should always go to the research-intensive institution. And so it seems to me that that's the third thing we've got to get rid of. Otherwise, we'll never get out of this false debate between historically black universities and historically white about who was more disadvantaged and advantaged and who should get access to these resources. The fourth principle is that our education system must be flexible enough to allow institutions to progress from one institutional type to another. Societies and their needs change over different historical moments. And we must give institutions the right to evolve, to become more responsive to those needs in different historical periods. Moreover, allowing institutions the right of evolution enables university executives to be more pragmatic in their current decision-making, since their institutions are never forever closed from becoming one institutional type or the other. And it seems to me that if we don't get a handle on these four principles and make them the fundamental basis for an evolution of our system, higher education system, we will not be able to free ourselves of what is effectively a colonial consciousness, where we're all trying to be what we were never allowed to be. But however well we implement these principles, we are unlikely to make progress in this regard as long as our institutions and higher education and universities do not learn to partner and work with each other. You know, we often say that we are collaborative. We're collegiate institutions. We often talk about science having no boundaries and how it's never had national boundaries. But you'd be amazed at how many institutional boundaries it has. And you would be amazed at the competitive dynamic between our institutions, my one included. A couple of weeks ago, I had this fascinating engagement. There was a very famous global scholar coming on I won't say the field because it won't be hard to figure out what happened. And there's a number, and obviously this is a global scholar who has really done some pioneering work in recent years. And so the idea was that we would allow this person to move around the higher education system. And so we requested, hey, could we host this individual? And then it was agreed. And then we said to the persons, okay, well, we'll have a workshop and this person would be invited. And could we then have a dinner where I would bring a couple of scholars together and we'd have an interaction over the evening? And we were told that's not allowed, because the institution that had brought the person that deemed it inappropriate that we have dinner with the person. And we then had to agree that we would have a dinner, but that we will proportionally allocate the number of guests from each institution so that it would equalize the playing field over dinner. And I would say, well, I'm happy to host this at my house. And they said, no, it's not allowed. It's not neutral territory. And we need to find a special. So what do we land up doing? We went all to a hotel and paid, 15 grand to have a dinner which we could have done for free. Simply because of the very competitive dynamic of our institution, all of these institutions claim to be transformative, social democratic, collegiate, anti-neoliberal, and yet we behave in this kind of way. And these are public institutions, by the way. So I really think we need a serious conversation about partnership and how these partnerships work. If we are unable to breach our institutional boundaries, and particularly the racialized boundaries of the higher education system, we're going to simply be in serious, serious trouble. One of the things that has by default happened, whether we want to admit it or not, is our historically black universities have effectively become the reservoirs for poor students. The historically white universities have effectively become the place for the middle classes, with some mixing and some allowance of poor students coming into the system. And obviously, in our historical context, that's taken a racial logic in all kinds of ways. And unless we are capable of breaching those institutional boundaries, but also breaching those institutional boundaries across the racial divides and class divides of our education system, we're going to be in serious, serious trouble. And I want to give you one example about where some imagination is required. So one of the things that we're experimenting with is we've just ended at WITS into a partnership with the University of India. And the thing we're trying at this, and by the way, it wasn't an innovative idea that came from me. What had happened is I saw that we had a similar relationship with another historically white university, and therefore we said, why can't we deploy this in a different context? And basically it is that the University of India doesn't have an engineering school. And so one of the things, yet it is located in an environment in Limpopo, which is surrounded by mining companies, which require all kinds of engineering programs. And what we entered into is a partnership with the University of India, where we're exploring how do we breach the institutional boundaries and the disciplinary boundaries of our institutions. So Venda has a BSc program. And by engaging them and working closely with them in their BSc program, we're in the verge of creating a new program that says, we will take, as WITS, a group of students from Venda's BSc program directly into third-year engineering at WITS. And so what you do is, after a 5-year degree, you get 3 years, you get a BSc at the University of Venda, and then an engineering degree from WITS University. And the logic is to break institutional boundaries, but it's also to break disciplinary boundaries. Because actually, if you're very clever with the BSc degree, you can actually provide enough foundation and more for the 3rd and 4th year engineering programs. And so it seems to me that that's just one example, and I know there's multiple examples of this at multiple universities. But what we cannot do is breach institutional boundaries in ways that are simply CSI programs, corporate social investment or corporate social responsibility program. What it has to do is be at the very core of the academy itself. It has to be at the very core of what we teach and how we research and what we research. Because if we can do that, we then fundamentally create a mobility and a breaching of institutional boundaries that is fundamental to who we are and who we become. So I really want to end at this point. And I want to kind of end with 2 things. The transformation struggle, the transformation upsurge on our campuses has been long overdue and must be welcomed. But it can only be welcomed if it's founded on progressive principles. That it's founded on achieving progressive radical outcomes in ways that are not necessarily violent. It is founded on principles that take quality seriously, not quality defined by our predecessors, but quality defined by us. We shouldn't reject the principle of quality. And too often, in the language of transformation, we've ignored it. At best, we've kind of not wanted to deliberate on it, and it seems to me that it's fundamental to that principle. But what it also means is that we've got to come together as a system and respond to the challenges of our time, both to be globally competitive and nationally responsive, as a system as a whole. And that requires partnerships. It requires breaching institutional boundaries. It requires doing so proactively. But it fundamentally requires rejecting our colonial consciousness and having the courage to transcend it. To say that we are truly free from the burdens of our legacy. And because we are free, we have the courage to define what we want to be in ways that are not burdened by our past, in ways that allow us to be the kind of humanity that our Constitution pledges us to be. And that requires hard choices. It requires, most importantly, intellectual courage. And it requires intellectual courage not only from vice-chancellors. Most fundamentally, it requires intellectual courage from the academy itself. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Adam. I think that you've really set a wonderful stage for us to have this debate and discussion. I just, when you were speaking about differentiation, it reminded me of a conversation we had with Jamil Salmi. He was here about 2 years ago, and I asked him this, he's written about this world-class institutions. So I asked him, in his studies of, he's looked at world-class institutions across the world, is there one that stood out for him? And he had an example which just underscores your point about we really have to think out of the box. He said there's one particular institution, it's actually a school of engineering. So it only produces engineers somewhere in the US. But the interesting thing is that every research engineer or engineering professor in the country is lined up and wants to go and teach there. So all they do is just produce engineers, but they produce them of such quality, and just the whole way the teaching, learning, and the curriculum is set up is that engineering professors from all the top universities want to go and teach there. So I thank you very much for inspiring us. So the floor is open for questions. We'll take about 3 or 4 at a time. I think there are some mics around. Okay. Do I see any hands? People are absorbing and making sense of the discussion. Okay, there we go. On the right there. Thank you.
Anthony Rippon, Mancosa. Okay. Thanks, Professor. We really enjoyed that. It was quite enlightening and also vibrant in where I think we should go forward. Just a question, how do you see moving from outside of the box to virtually, if we can say, without the box thinking? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we have 2 here, one in front and one on the...
My name is Maxwell. I am from Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. I found this conference very interesting, and both of you have been very brilliant. I'm originally from Ghana, but now I'm the diaspora in the UK for over 20 years. And I was really impressed by Professor Habib about the whole issue around what Steve Biko said. And my question really is, what is the South African government really doing to address this issue?
Okay, and let's take the third one there and we'll take a response after that.
My name is Baphiwe Dawiti. I'm from the Durban University of Technology. It seems to me that the central challenge that is faced by universities in South Africa is the issue of funding. And I think that issues of funding affect teaching and learning if learners are concerned about how they're going to pay their fees or for accommodation and so on. And it seems to me that there's a redirection of funding for higher education institutions towards the TVETs. I would like the professor to give some ideas of how the issue of funding can be addressed in higher education institutions in South Africa.
Okay, Adam, do you want to take those few?
So thank you very much. I mean, Anthony, I think it was Anthony, right? So, how do you move to out-of-the-box thinking from within our institutions? And my answer to this is a very simple one, actually. By being pragmatic and responding to the actual concerns or the actual challenges you confront. Jonathan Jansen, who I think perhaps sometimes is really useful because he answers how he responds to the immediate challenges of the context, and he's able to kind of shine a mirror back to society and back to the educational elite that very much he is a part of, I might add. Here's the challenge he often says. You want to fix education, and he's talking about primary and secondary education often. He says, do not write a new curriculum statement. And please do not write a new policy document. Do simple things. Make sure that students are in the classroom for 7 hours a day. Make sure the teachers are in the classroom for 7 hours a day. Make sure the teachers who are teaching the children know what they're teaching. And fix up the infrastructure. If you can get those 4 things happen, it doesn't matter how substantive, how great if you can get those things, it doesn't matter how bad your policy is, you'll make 70% of the problem go away. Yet for 20 years, every time we have this thing, all of us who've been trained in, these research-intensive universities, or in many of these universities in other parts of the world, we run to write a new policy document. And I think I had the same debate with the mayor of Johannesburg the other day. We are having a bit of a battle. And I said, you want to be a world-class city? Because Johannesburg's got this great slogan, we are a world-class African city. I said, don't have conferences about the subject. Don't take adverts out in the Sunday Times. Fix the bloody lights, fix the potholes in the road, do the basic stuff. Because it doesn't matter how grand and how grandiose your marketing is. If you don't fix those 3 or 4 things, you are in trouble. And it seems to me that that's the answer to thinking about out of the box. One of the biggest problems about universities is because we are so institutions of such history. We think through the basis of rules, or we think through the pedagogy of inherited practice. But what we need to do is actually focus on the challenge itself and say, how do we address this challenge in this historical moment, given the historical resources we have? The question that we have to ask is not say we want to teach a student we wish we had. We have to teach the student we have. And there is actually quite a significant set of experiences, both in this country and elsewhere, where students that are not sufficiently prepared can be taught and can be brought up to speed. So for me, I'm looking for some pragmatism. You want to do out-of-the-box thinking, kind of understand the problem, and forget the rules for a minute. And forget what everybody's written over the last 100 years. Ask, how would you do this practically in this context? And what is the range of experiences that tried to do this in other historical things, and craft a pedagogy of responsiveness to the challenge you have. And I'll come and give you an example of this in the financing thing in a minute. But I think we need to do that. That needs to become, if you like, the modus operandi of all of our institutions, from the top to the bottom, because it can fundamentally change what is possible. The question about BICO and what government, that the South African government is saying, I'm sorry to say, I wish I had a better answer. I actually think that the South African government has been dithering. To be fair, I think the Department of Higher Education has been very good at some levels by crafting an agenda. So the idea of growing the FET sector, the idea of offering post-secondary options, the idea of creating a diverse system, I think is absolutely responsive. Ironically, I've said, if the TLHEC succeeds in building the FET sector and addressing vocational skills, South African capitalism would have to thank the General Secretary of the Communist Party for resolving its fundamental challenge of the market economy. That's the irony of it. Because he actually has quite an astute understanding of the challenges that exist. The problem has been at implementation level. And there we've actually been disastrous, both at the level of the institutions we've built and in the hard choices and trade-offs that need to be made. And that I do think that actually the alienation that black students confront in higher education systems today is a fault of its executive leadership at the universities, but it's as much a fault of government itself. Because you can't talk about the failure of the African professoriate in 2015 without understanding the failure of South African postgraduate students in the late 1990s. I taught at UKZN just around the turn of the century. And I was teaching a master's course in development studies. And I must have had 25 to 30 students in the class. About 75%, 80%, maybe 85%. Well, firstly, 50% were foreign. That was quite striking about that. About 30%, 35% were white or Indian. And we must have had about 10 or 15% that were African, South African. The reason was very simple. Because as they came out of undergraduate studies, they were the children of working class people who were under major pressure to actually start earning to support masters and PhDs. Yet our scholarship programs in the 1990s was premised on the middle class student, drawn from, by the way, the UK and the US, where the assumption is mommy and daddy take care of themselves, and that what you need is a little tuition money, some accommodation money, and some booze money for the weekends. That was how scholarship constructed. But that wasn't true. Because most of our children of working class parents were taking half of the money, and today they still do this, sending it back home to support the family. Or they couldn't afford to do postgraduate studies because they had to quickly earn an income to let this thing. So the failure of how we constructed 15 years ago the scholarship program lives with us, the burdens of today. That does not mean that vice chancellors are off the hook. Because there is a lack of imagination. We put an advert in the Sunday Times in hopes that somebody applies. And then when nobody applies, we say, oops, nobody applied, there isn't any staff members. What we've forgotten is that most recruitment happens through networks, whether in the public universities or in the private sector. And our networks are, by their very nature, racialized. And so one of the biggest questions to ask is, how do you get executives to break out of the racialized networks they've inherited? Because if you can't do that, you can't do imaginative recruitment in South Africa in 2015. And so it seems to me that those are hard questions we've got to ask. And frankly, government hasn't provided responses, and neither have university executives. And too often, we haven't been making and asking the hard questions. Ask yourself today, in this massive upsurge of student protest, student questioning of what it means to be at the university. Blade Nzimande has commented and made some important remarks in this regard, as is the Department of Higher Education and Training. But we haven't heard anything from Jacob Zuma. We have not heard a single word. We have not heard a single word from anyone else in the presidency or in many of the other institutions. How is it that there can be such a failure? Such a failure of leadership at this moment. And that takes me to the third question, which was posed. I couldn't remember where the person was. I couldn't see the person. I think you're absolutely right. We can talk about transformation as much as we want. If we do not fix financing of higher education, we're in trouble. And the financing of higher education has two distinctive parts that have to be considered. Part one is the subsidy to the institution and the universities. And if you look at the task team by Department of Higher Education and Training under Cyril Ramaphosa, what it suggested is that if you take the global average, including the African countries, we should be funding higher education at something like 37 billion in 2012 figures. Today, in 2012 figures, we fund higher education and university education at 22 billion. There's a 50 to 60% underfunding of higher education at the moment. That's not my figures, it's government's own task team. Before he was deputy president, under Cyril Ramaphosa, before he became deputy president. Now, if we don't address this, we're in trouble. It's true that 22% of GDP goes into education, but only 12% of that goes into higher education. And is that an appropriate thing, and what are the consequences of that? There's a second part of that, is as we've not been funded appropriately, as the per capita funding of students has gone down over the last 20 years, universities have compensated with double-digit increases. And so, in effect, there's been this crazy call to cap fees. And I'm for capping fees because I don't believe double-digit increases are sustainable any longer. But you can't cap fees if the state is giving you a 3% subsidy increase in an inflationary environment of 6%. Because that's going to have a dramatic effect. But the question is, how do we confront the issue of student fees? So here's the dilemma. If you take every single student in the university system, every single student, rich or poor, black and white, their fees per annum is less than 20 billion. If you look at NSFAS for 2016, it's 11.5 billion. 11.5 billion. That's not a big jump. We could resolve this crisis in one day. If you look at the banking system, by the way, the banking system takes on the basis of collateral. This is their model. On the basis of collateral, they gear 10 times on the open market, on a normal commercial model. So if you gave them 11.5 billion, on a normal commercial model, they will raise 110 billion and give you available. We only need 20 billion, less than 20. Obviously, we're not in a commercial model because you're never going to charge interest immediately and you're never going to charge at full price. So what you say, okay, don't do it 10 times, do it simply 3 times. Gear 3 times the level and you have more money to fund the entire of higher education. Every year. Now somebody says to me, well, it comes with a trade-off. Of course it comes with a trade-off. You know what the trade-off is? That everybody will inherit a debt. But there's 2 questions. Firstly, NSFAS is already a loan. It's not a scholarship. And secondly, would you rather have graduates with debt than no graduates at all? At the moment, 55% of our students drop out of the higher education system. A large number as a result of fees and not being able to afford their studies. And then you do what capitalism is so great at. So in 15 years, I'm almost certain you'll have a debt of R1 trillion. But capitalism's got this wonderful invention called bankruptcy. You declare bankruptcy, you legislate the debt away, and you start again. But you would have resolved the single biggest challenge in higher education that confronts us today. But what are we doing? We're so caught up in the ideological challenges that we're not fundamentally addressing it. So there's some attempts to do this. At the end of this, at the end of the last round of protests in January, February, we wrote to each of the banks and said, could we sit around the table and talk? But I do think we need to start thinking about new models. Because frankly, we cannot go on like this. And the most graphic expression of this was in UKZN, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. We cannot go on like this. Because if we continue like this, we won't have a university system. Or at least not one worth talking about. And then the real people who lose out is not the poor. It's not the rich. Because the rich will buy themselves out of it one way or the other. It's the poor that will really suffer the consequences of losing the public higher education system. And it seems to me that that's the fundamental challenge that our problems are not insurmountable. They can be addressed. It requires political will and it requires imagination, out of the box thinking. That's what it requires. And that's what I think we need to do at this historical moment. Thank you very, very much.
I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, but I think, will you join me in really thanking Adam for setting a wonderful scene for us for engagement over the next few days in the conference? Could you join me in thanking him once more? Thank you. Before you go.
Thank you very much. Lovely.